Hey guys, welcome back to Dorm Debate Podcast and welcome back to John's Fantasy Football Show or Fantasy Football Podcast, whatever you want to call it. So we are back for Season 3. If I'm correct, this is the first video on YouTube that you guys will be seeing of Dorm Debate Season 3. If you haven't checked out our TikTok, we've been posting since August 1st, so definitely go over and check that out. But glad to have you guys back for this season. Hopefully you guys are psyched for fantasy football. Hopefully you guys haven't drafted yet because I have a lot of advice coming in this video, the next video that's going to be posted later today and next week. So hope you guys had a fantastic summer, but hope you're ready for the grind of the fantasy football season because, to be honest, I can't wait. But I do want to talk about a couple things first. I did change, or Dorm Debate did change the format for our YouTube videos. So basically, last season, we were doing 35, 40-minute TikTok or YouTube videos for my fantasy football show, posting them on Saturdays. This season is going to be a little different. We're going to continue to post on Saturdays, but the clips or the videos are going to be 8 to 10 minutes long. So basically trying to cram more content into shorter videos for you guys so that you could pick and choose which segments you want to listen to instead of going to the 40-minute podcast and just fast forwarding or rewinding based on where you want to listen to my advice. So in this video, it's going to be 8 to 10 minutes long, and I'm going to be talking about the old faces in the new places. But before I get into it, I want to mention one thing. If you guys haven't checked out our Patreon, go over and check out our Patreon. Patreon's a free app that you can download and follow us on, and that's where a lot of our good advice and my good fantasy advice goes to. So if you guys don't know what Patreon is, definitely check it out. And if you do know, definitely head over and follow us because on there you can get my weekly picks, rankings, my weekly sits, my draft advice for every draft that you have, every league size. And you can message me there if you're part of Tier 2 or Tier 3, and I can answer all your questions. And the most important thing about this video is what I'm about to mention, and that next Saturday, a week from today, I am going to be posting an all-inclusive fantasy football draft podcast on the Patreon. And the reason it's only being put on the Patreon is because we've had supporters last season and this season. We have a bunch of people supporting us on there, and they've been great to us. So we want to give them some extra content. So if you guys want to see that, you definitely have to head over to the Patreon. All you have to do is be part of any tier of the Patreon, and you're going to have access to that podcast next Saturday. And in that podcast, I'm literally going to sit down and I'm going to do exactly this, but I'm going to do it for 45 minutes, and I'm going to go through the do's and don'ts of drafts. I'm going to go through breakouts, sleepers, undervalued players, overvalued players, and I'm literally going to sit down and go through the ADP and cross out guys that I don't think you should draft, and I'm going to tell you the guys that I'm actually targeting in my draft, like the drafts that I'm going to that I have 12-team leagues, 10-team leagues, 16 leagues, 6-team leagues. I'm literally going to go through and tell you which players I'm targeting at each position, who I'm staying away from, and who I really like for this season. So to get all that and to be a part of that video and to watch that, head over to the Patreon and be a member or a supporter by next Saturday, and you'll get to that video. So before I waste all my time talking about that stuff, I'm going to get into the meat and bones of this video, which is old faces in new places. So how does that relate to fantasy football? Well, there's been a lot of coaching changes and a lot of player changes with trades and free agent signings since last season. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, I haven't really kept up with too much of the news of who's went where. I know Russell Wilson and Davante Adams, but what about the smaller guys? What about some of the coaches? Does that have any effect on fantasy football? And I'm here to tell you that, yes, it does. And I think it's a good transition into the football season and into the fantasy football draft as my first video because it gives you a background of some things that happened last season and talks about some changes that will happen this season, how it could affect your fantasy football season and your draft coming up. So I wanted to talk about some coaching changes and some takeaways from them, and then some player changes and some takeaways from them and how those changes affect your fantasy football draft. So I'm going to start out with the coaching changes. There's 3 notable coaching changes that happened in the offseason that I think is going to affect your fantasy football draft. The first is that the Bears got a new offensive coordinator. His name is Luke Getsy. He spent the last 3 seasons as the Packers QB coach. And working with Aaron Rodgers and Davante Adams on the Packers, Getsy really got a feel for the dynamic between quarterback and wide receiver. And when we look at the Bears, who's the top receiver there? It's Darnell Mooney. So Fields and Mooney hopefully can take the next step this season. And Getsy spent time with Rodgers and Adams where Adams was heavily targeted. his target share in that offense was massive. So maybe we could see the same thing for Darnell Mooney. We saw it late last season when Allen Robinson was completely phased out of the offense. And Darnell Mooney was my number one weekly pick in week 17, I believe it was, 17 or 18. And he ended up having like 25 fantasy points. So towards late last season and into this season, I think that's a plus for Darnell Mooney, getting that offensive coordinator that has that connection, that knows how important that connection is between quarterback and wide receiver and targeting the receiver a lot. And I have Darnell Mooney 21 in my wide receiver rankings. The consensus is 27. So I have him 6 spots above consensus. I don't think he's going to break out completely, but I do think he will exceed expectations. The second one, a lot of you guys probably know, new head coach for the Miami Dolphins is Mike McDaniel. He was previously the offensive coordinator for the San Francisco 49ers, and he and Kyle Shanahan were credited with unleashing Deebo's full potential last year with all those rushing capabilities he had. So Mike McDaniel knows how to take the best player on the offense, like he did with Deebo last season, and give them a lot of touches, manufacture touches for them, whether it be in the rushing game, jet sweeps, crosses, drag plays across the middle, or deep shots to Deebo. And I think they're going to do the same thing with Tyreek Hill. Of course, he came over from Kansas City. They're going to manufacture touches for him and get him the ball a lot. I have Tyreek ranked 6 in my rankings for wide receivers, and the consensus is 8. So I have him a little bit above the consensus rankings. The third and final and most important coaching change for this season is the new Vikings head coach, Kevin O'Connell, who spent the last 2 seasons as the Rams offensive coordinator, worked with Sean McVay, Matt Stafford, Cooper Kupp, won a Super Bowl, and Cooper Kupp had the best wide receiver season of all time in fantasy football. O'Donnell and McVay worked together to get Cooper Kupp, move him around the field and get him targeted a lot, have a lot of success. So I think, Justin Jefferson in that Vikings offense, O'Connell already hinted about moving Jefferson around a lot. Jefferson already spoke out in the offseason saying this is not a run-first offense anymore. This new Vikings offense is going to feature Jefferson. It's going to be pass-heavy, and Jefferson's going to be the focal point. So Jefferson is currently going as the number 2 receiver off boards. I have him at number 1, right around there. If you take Cooper Kupp 1 and Jefferson 2, I wouldn't have a problem with that. But I think Jefferson's going to have a great season, could definitely finish as the wide receiver 1 by the time the season is over. And now I want to move on to the player change takeaways. So I have 4 of them for you right now. So some people that were traded, some teams, made some new acquisitions, and I'm going to talk about how they might affect fantasy football. So the first, which you guys know, Davante Adams, went from Green Bay to Las Vegas. What does that mean? Well, Aaron Rodgers, that's a downgrade for him. I mean, I have him number 12 in my rankings. The consensus is number 10 quarterback. So I'm a little, not as high on him. I still think he's going to get 30, 35 touchdowns, but the yards I'm really concerned about. That offense is going to be revolved around Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon. Davante Adams, I have a little bit of downgrade for him. Actually, he's consensus number 4 wide receiver. I have him going number 9 out of wide receivers, which is pretty low. And the reason is because he has to compete for targets with Waller and Renfrow. And not to mention, Josh McDaniels isn't one of those offensive coordinators that targets a guy a lot. So he's probably going to spread the ball around. Josh Jacobs will run it. That defense is a little bit improved. The only thing going for him is that division is going to be high scoring. So hopefully Davante can get a lot of targets there. And I'm going to upgrade Allen Lazard. I am pretty high on him this season. You guys will hear me talk about him in the next video that we're posting later today. But I think Lazard's going to have a great season. And if Rodgers is going to throw 30, 35 touchdowns, but not a lot of yards, Lazard can definitely get double-digit touchdowns. And when you look at players like Lazard, players like that Rodgers, when he loses his number 1, he usually goes to players that he has experience with, has a connection with. Lazard would be the longest tenured player, wide receiver for the Packers. Randall Cobb is there, but he plays the slot. He's slowing up a little bit. Sammy Watkins doesn't have that rapport with Rodgers, and neither does rookie Christian Watson. So I like Lazard. The second player is Russell Wilson to the Broncos. It's obviously a downgrade for DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. I'm not drafting them in any of my leagues. People have them a little higher than I really have them in my rankings. But it's an upgrade for all Denver skill players. Javonte Williams, Melvin Gordon, but especially Courtland Sutton. He's going consensus number 22 wide receiver. I have him going number 20. He's my 20th ranked wide receiver. So I really like Sutton. Jeudy I like as well, just not as much as Sutton. And throughout camp, we've heard that Wilson and Sutton have a great connection, and Sutton seems like the guy to go to. Trey Lance is the third guy I'm talking about. He's now the starter in San Francisco. Jimmy G's on his way out. Honestly, it's a neutral grade for Debo. I think he's still going to get the touches he deserves. He signed the contract. There's some rushing incentives in that contract. So the consensus is wide receiver 6. I have him going wide receiver 5. Slight downgrade for Kittle, Ayuk, and Mitchell because of Trey Lance's rushing ability and because of his lack of accuracy compared to Jimmy Garoppolo early in the season at least. And the last player is Tyreek Hill to Miami. I talked about Miami a little bit before. I like Tyreek. It's a downgrade for Mahomes. Mahomes is going as the number 2 quarterback, which I think is insane. He should be going as the number 5 quarterback. That's how I have him ranked on my board because, Justin Herbert finished the season last year as the number 2 quarterback behind Josh Allen, and Mahomes was behind Herbert. So now Mahomes loses Tyreek Hill, and people think Mahomes is going to be better than Herbert, who didn't lose anybody. I'm not buying that. I think Mahomes is going to take a little bit of a step down this season. I wouldn't have him in my top 4 or top 3. He's my number 5 quarterback. Slight downgrade for Waddle because those short and intermediate routes, obviously Tyreek will be doing those as well. So Waddle won't hit his reception total like he did last season, but he's still a solid pick in the mid, teens for wide receivers. And an upgrade for Tua and the Kansas City skill players other than Kelce. Obviously, Juju seems to be the number 1 wide receiver there outside of Kelce. And, Sky Moore might start to creep up later in the season, so I do like him as well. So those are some coaching changes and some player changes that happened this offseason that you guys should know about and how it affects fantasy football and your draft. So definitely take note of that and check out the video we have being posted later today. It's going to give you more advice on some breakouts and sleepers that I have for this season. And, make sure to check out that Patreon because next Saturday, the all-inclusive fantasy football draft podcast is going to be posted on the Patreon, and that's going to be your hub for all fantasy football draft advice, do's, don'ts, who I'm drafting, who I'm not drafting, and all that. And as always, you can message me over on the Patreon. So thank you guys for being back. I'm glad to have you back. And, as always, stay safe, stay healthy, and have a lot of fun playing fantasy football.